This is a world exclusive, everybody. We have Bitcoin's foremost philosophy professors being interviewed by Bitcoin's foremost philosophy shitposter. So only in Bedford. So Andrew, Bradley, and Craig are co-authors of Resistance Money, A Philosophical Case for Bitcoin, which will come out on June 14th. That's correct. Yeah. You can pre-order it now, though, and you should, because it is excellent. I was very grateful to get a copy in advance so I could prepare for this panel. Really is a wonderful book. We'll dive into the book a little bit later on. I want to start off, though, with you guys introducing yourselves, give a bit about your backgrounds. What I want you to try to flesh out, just to help out the audience a bit, is basically, you don't need to answer this question directly unless you really want to, but what on earth are a bunch of academic philosophers doing in Bitcoin in the first place? Don't you know that this space is primarily for disgruntled economists and underpaid software engineers? Kick us off, Andrew.
I'm Andrew. I teach in a philosophy, politics, and economics program in Singapore. And one thing we try to do there is bring together these three topics. So intersectional topics are important for us. And what do you know it? Bitcoin turned out to be one of those. So in some ways, it was my students who pulled me into the space, and I came to see that Bitcoin is a site where philosophy can help us bring together many other things. So it's a useful tool in the classroom, but it turns out that it takes on a life of its own in your own mind and your own interaction with students, and then it became a research program. And then it turns into something even more when you've got buds working on it with you. That's these guys.
Yeah, my interest in Bitcoin had nothing to do with my interest in philosophy for the first 6 years that I was interested in Bitcoin. And it wasn't until I went to a philosophy conference to give a talk about the nature of objects and properties that there was someone else there who was giving a talk on Bitcoin. And the title of the talk was, "What is Bitcoin?" And it's a paper that was eventually published in a philosophy journal. And I thought it was so fruitful and so interesting and so engaging. And I was already friends with the author. And so I approached the author sitting to my left at a dinner that night. And I was like, "So you're writing and thinking about Bitcoin?" And he said, "You're thinking about Bitcoin?" And so we started a Gmail chat, and we started writing papers about the metaphysics and ethics and other things. And it's kind of taken off from there.
So I also teach philosophy at a university, and I think I'm here, just as most of us are here, through some combination of luck and some combination of improbable events. So I finally took Bitcoin seriously in early 2018, and I read the white paper, and it blew my mind. And I thought that at the time, the scholarly literature was quite lacking in the discipline of philosophy. And as philosophy is a kind of overarching philosophy that connects with, or overarching discipline that other disciplines can connect to, I was quite happy to start working on it and push my other research projects to the side. And that's when I met Brad and Andrew and thought, I think we could really do something worthwhile here.
How much did you guys think about money before coming across Bitcoin? I mean, did you even think about it at all, really, in philosophical terms?
Not at all, no. My research in philosophy was in metaphysics and the nature of the grounding relation and space and time and reality. And there's a branch of metaphysics called social metaphysics that is asking questions about social objects, one of which is money. And I didn't do any of that kind of metaphysics. Even after I knew what Bitcoin was and got interested in Bitcoin as a tool for international remittances was the first thought that I had. And I assumed that it was backed by dollars because money would have to be backed by dollars. It took a very long time for me to even realize that money could be something that wasn't printed by a government and distributed by a government and run by a government and things like that. So it took quite a while to think of Bitcoin as a research interest and to think of the philosophy of money as something that I could do.
And for the audience's benefit, I mean, is there much literature to draw on here? Is there a philosophy of money academically? Or are you guys just making it up? Sorry, inventing, not fabricating.
Yes.
Wait, yes, your fabric? No, what?
There's a bit. We didn't like it so much, so we made our own. Philosophy of money, that is.
All right, good answer. Yeah, I thought. What did you? Or maybe do this one at a time, or jump in whoever thinks of a good answer first. What did you each find most philosophically interesting about Bitcoin whenever you first discovered it? What tied? I mean, other than obviously it's interesting in its own right, but again, trying to bring it back to your academic background, what was the first thing that kind of clicked for you?
Brad has already touched on one dimension, which is that Bitcoin isn't backed, and it has very different properties from other monies that we're more familiar with. And once you notice that, you start to wonder, well, what properties make something money in the first place, and which properties make something a good money? So Bitcoin, just because it's unusual, because it doesn't have intrinsic value, and yet it's costly to produce, that is a strange combination that leads you to wonder about the relevance of cost of production to the value of a money, and whether money needs to be useful in some non-monetary way to be valuable at all. So it's Bitcoin's strangeness that prompts us to ask weird questions, and those take you straight towards areas of philosophy that most of us don't think about very much. And that turns out to be super fun as a researcher, but also super useful as a teacher, because you want unusual questions that get students thinking, and Bitcoin gives us as many of those kinds of questions we want, and indeed more.
We started off our research project with the title Stateless Money. So it was a negative thesis about Bitcoin, something that Bitcoin is not. It is not run by a state. And we persisted in that for several months until we realized that what was more important than the negative aspect was the positive aspect. Bitcoin serves as resistance money. So the most interesting thing for me are the moral and ethical questions about Bitcoin. First, how various moral goods line up with Bitcoin. So we talk about privacy, we talk about censorship resistance, we talk about financial inclusion. These things are really important to me. I'm most invested in getting Bitcoin into the hands of people who need it to resist. And then there's this other aspect of the moral and ethical dimension of Bitcoin, which is sort of at the meta level, about questions about monetary policy and what the morally best monetary policy is. There's questions about competition and whether it's good that Bitcoin exists in order to provide a competitive check against other kinds of money. So we have the sort of first order ethical questions about applications, and then this higher order ethical questions about the nature of the best, morally best money.
I went through 3 layers of discovery. The first layer was just the understanding of a few different disciplines in order to understand Bitcoin overall in the first place. So Bitcoin's interdisciplinarity really blew me away. And then once I gained some minimal amount of understanding, I was struck by the novelty. It broke apart my naive views about money and how money works in the world. And then the third thing that really struck me was that Bitcoin is actually doing good in the world. So it's not just novelty in the sense that like Apple was novel 15 years ago, but it's novel in a way that people who are doing less well around the world can actually improve their lives.
Nice. We're edging closer to just discussing the book sort of more explicitly. I'm curious though, because I know that you've had this research project for a while before that, and the book sort of grew out of the work you were doing. What has the reaction been like from your colleagues to deciding to pursue this at all?
The reaction from my colleagues, I think, has been the most positive of all of us. I teach at the University of Wyoming, and we have a senator who is leading the charge on Bitcoin, and we have very friendly cryptocurrency laws due to the efforts of Caitlin Long over in Cheyenne. And we're also very focused as a university on public outreach. So taking whatever research you're working on and getting it in front of people who don't attend the university, who don't work at the university. And when I was writing papers on mereological nihilism and grounding, that was really hard to do. Nobody cared. They still don't.
I care, Bradley.
And then I thought, well, maybe my philosophy of religion work will be interesting to the public, and it's not really. But here I am looking at 500 people and talking about a research project that I spent the last 2 or 3 years working on. So my university has been fantastically supportive, and I thank them very much for allowing me to use my research time on this, right? They pay me to do research, and what I chose to do research on was Bitcoin, and they never said no, or that's stupid, or do something else. They've been really supportive.
I work closely with economists, and they viewed this first, my own interest in Bitcoin, as a kind of naive, cute little thing that they'll allow their colleague to do because they value my other work. And then I persisted. And eventually they started asking questions too, and I think it's Bitcoin's own persistence and the interest of students that has led them to permit me to do what I do. So I face troubles here and there with getting courses listed on the books for credit. But Bitcoin's own ability to sustain existence in the world, to not die, turns out to turn heads. And it turns the heads of younger people too. And of course, they are the future.
I think academics are generally fundamentally conservative, I think for 2 reasons. Number one, I think we're all herd animals within the tribes that we find ourselves. And in academia, you don't want to desert the herd, because when you desert the herd, you leave behind certain professional and reputational goodies. And we have experienced some of that. So there's a bit of, I think, cowardice among people who don't want to leave certain communities within universities. But I also think that academics are fundamentally conservative because research projects take so long. And answering a question can take a long time, can take 3 to 5 years to wrap up a project. And so universities are just by necessity going to lag our technological advancement. And it's from this more understandable and empathetic position that I think my colleagues, when they heard that I was interested in Bitcoin, they nominated a candidate in the department to take me out to lunch the next day to figure out, well, what is this guy throwing away his career? And so it's some combination for me of amusement and also just lack of interest.
I'll ask you all to answer this individually, because I think you might have interesting answers, but just teasing this out a bit more. What is the most frustrating pushback you have got from colleagues on the topic? Or actually, I tell you what, you can choose which of these to answer, either that one, or if you want to be more positive, what's the most insightful pushback that you've got?
One repeating and frustrating refrain is the inserting of cryptocurrency or the replacement. So I say in conversation, I work on Bitcoin. Oh, what's your work on cryptocurrency like? Actually, it was Bitcoin. I meant what I said. It is very difficult to express concisely and in a way that makes sense to an outsider that there is a difference. And I mean what I say when I said Bitcoin, but nobody believes me until they've heard me say it 3 or 4 times. And that's frustrating. I doubt this is news to anybody in this room, though.
I think another thing is that the perception of working on Bitcoin is that we are going to try to sell them something, or that we're trying to pump up the price of something that we own. And that's seen as illegitimate. Normally in philosophy, when you're talking about metaphysical or epistemological or ethical questions, you don't have a financial stake in the things that you're talking about. And if you do, say if you're working on a paper on the morality of sweatshops and you own some stock in the sweatshops, you should probably ethically disclose that. So we do ethically disclose in everything that we write that we own Bitcoin, that we also own US dollars or Singapore dollars, and that we have an interest in this. And we also point out to people that there are people who have an interest in Bitcoin not succeeding for various reasons, and that the criticisms that they've heard might come from not totally pure-hearted motives.
Bitcoin is a brand, and I think that the initial reaction that we've received from certain people is explained by this. So the internet is not really a brand. It was never itself monetized. You can't buy shares in TCP/IP. And as a result, I think, especially university administrators, think that researching Bitcoin specifically is like researching Microsoft or Apple. It's very narrow. And I think they've yet to come around to the idea that no, Bitcoin is more like the internet. It's just that Bitcoin is itself a form of money and is by definition monetized.
I want to pick up on Bradley's answer because actually I think this gives a perfect segue to the book. So I'll ask about the book in much more general detail next. But if I remember correctly, I think this is in the very first chapter where you explicitly say that you are not marketing Bitcoin. Hopefully this sounds familiar, right? Can you, I guess, just explain that? Because when I read it, and then especially now, I was kind of skeptical. I'm not sure I believe you. Like, I market the shit out of Bitcoin. We're at a Bitcoin conference. Defend this position, please, if you don't mind.
Defend the position of not selling corn?
Not selling, that you are not marketing it, that you are merely searching for truth, let's say.
If we wanted to only make money, we wouldn't be philosophy professors. That's my first answer. For what it's worth, we've spent years of our lives studying and then helping other people study. And we like it because learning feels good. There are lots of things that feel good, sex and food and booze and whatever. But one of the great feelings in life is the aha moment, the light bulb. And that honestly is one of the drugs that these people on stage live for, the light bulb moment. And if you know anything about Bitcoin, you know that it can give you those light bulb moments. And we want to share those with students. We want to share those with readers. So maybe there is a self-interest element here, which is pursuing good feelings. But it's not just pampering the corn and making money. It's actually the good feeling of learning. We love that. That's really our lives. And that's what we do for a living. And that's what we hope to communicate with the book, is to help other people feel that insight, the light bulb. It's amazing.
At no point in the book do we encourage anyone to buy or hold Bitcoin. What we do encourage is for people to learn about it. And also, if you think that at any point in your life you might need resistance money, you might need a money that nobody knows what you're spending it on, that can't be blocked, that's inclusive, then you should learn how to use it. And that's, I think, the closest we get to marketing advice. We also say a lot of good things about Bitcoin, but that's because we think there are a lot of good things that are true about Bitcoin. But we leave it up to the reader to decide whether, on the basis of those good things, they want to buy it.
So we do think there's a great case for Bitcoin overall. Along the way, we also admit that Bitcoin isn't perfect in specific ways. And I think because of this, the book has some credibility. We aren't trying to convince people to buy Bitcoin. You don't have to be an Austrian economist or support Austrian economics to read and appreciate the book. It's very much a book that you can hand to a skeptic or a friend and be fairly confident that they're not going to feel like they're reading a pitch or about a scam.
Great, yeah. Okay, cool. We'll jump into it now. So the book itself, anyone feel free to just run with this, or obviously want to tease this out for as long as we can. As concisely as possible, what is the thesis of the book, or what are you willing to say now without spoiling any of it? But also, if any of you want to dive into the process of writing it too, because I assume that's going to be super interesting given your backgrounds.
We spent Tuesday in Washington, D.C. at the Bitcoin Policy Summit, which is put together by the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And the point of the day at the summit is to inform lawmakers and regulatory agencies about the nature of Bitcoin and to help them think through what they ought to think about it and do with it. We had 3 senators on the stage, 1 Democrat, 2 Republicans, several House representatives. Some House representatives came and just sat in the audience to listen and learn. And so shout out to David Zell and Grant McCarty, who are doing a fantastic job leading that organization. And if you have some extra sats, you might think about donating to this 501c3 nonprofit. Our task in that was to talk about how Bitcoin and cryptocurrency are different, and to talk about the distinctive features of Bitcoin that make it unique among cryptocurrencies, and to think about it through that lens. And the guiding question, which finally gets me to answer your question, is that we had up on the slides a number of times for these people to think about was, if you didn't know who you'd be tomorrow, would you want to wake up in a world with Bitcoin or a world without Bitcoin? So imagine that you might not be you, but that you might be someone living under authoritarianism, which is an appreciable fraction of the population, or someone living with a local currency that is rapidly devaluing due to inflation. That's an appreciable fraction of the population. What kind of risks are you willing to take waking up in a non-Bitcoin world? And we suggest everyone would want to wake up in a Bitcoin world.
Craig or Andrew, do you want to give a bit more background about how the book even came about, given we've covered your professional backgrounds that kind of led you to this point with the research project, but why a book?
There are a lot of objections to Bitcoin. We wanted to answer as many as we could, and you can't do that in an article here or an article there. So we made a list, and there were about 30. The book eventually answers about 25. And we learned that you can't just answer an objection or even a bunch of objections together. You need to have a framework. So part of our framework is just a statement of what Bitcoin is and what it does. And our thesis there is that Bitcoin is resistance money. It's a way to resist the overreach of corporations or states. And then we give a way to evaluate it. That's what Brad was talking about. We think that there's so many biases that cloud our minds. We need a tool to help us evaluate Bitcoin and to strip away some of those biases. And so that's what the question does. How would you feel about Bitcoin if you didn't know who you'd be? So those are two of the framing devices we use, is that this hypothesis about what Bitcoin is, and then a question, would you want there to be resistance money if you were evaluating the world not knowing what position you would have within that world? So that is the overarching frame of the book. And of course, we go through many different dimensions of evaluation, and along the way address many objections to the view that Bitcoin is good.
Is there a particular intended audience?
Some books are written for Bitcoiners. That's not this one. This is a book for someone who might not describe themselves as a Bitcoiner or want to be a Bitcoiner or even be open to Bitcoin. It is a scholarly book, so there's lots of footnotes, but you actually don't have to read them. There's some jokes, too. So we want to give something for people who want to think deeply, who are willing to think deeply, but who don't like the idea of Bitcoin as a brand or as a cult. We really want to speak widely to people who wouldn't be in a room like this.
So we worked quite hard to make the prose accessible and funny. So when you flip through the book, it's an enjoyable experience. But we are fiat academics. And although there's a real place for self-published books, for books that Saifedean has published, you will not hear me criticize these kinds of books that Bitcoiners buy. They are great books. But there is a particular kind of person, a particular kind of audience for which fiat credentials do mean something, and for which an academic publishing house, one of the top publishers, it means something. So in addition to the experience when you flip through the book, on the inside of the book, there's also a particular kind of experience when they just look at the front and back cover and say, oh, this has a stamp of approval that I respect.
Yeah, follow on directly to that, although anybody feel free to jump in with an answer. Do you have any particular hopes with what having published this book will achieve?
My hope is that graduate students who are working in a wide variety of fields, maybe related to Bitcoin or maybe not, and undergraduates pick up the book and they read it and they realize that there are professors working on Bitcoin and that Bitcoin is a legitimate area of academic interest, and they cite it in papers and they talk about it and they come to workshops that we put on, and that the network of Bitcoin academics grows.
One thing we can do is give people cover. We've taken the career risk. It's easier to follow than to lead. So that's just, there are a lot of people who simply won't do that until someone does it first, and we're happy to take point on that within academia and philosophy in particular.
I have a question that it may relate to the book, but it may not. It may just be more kind of about personal experience or more just drawing on the research program as a whole. But you guys all, obviously you're researchers, but you also teach for a living, right? What have you found best resonates with your students when they're learning about Bitcoin for the first time? I'm imagining that this is potentially going to be useful to people in the audience who find themselves in a similar position without being professional teachers.
Some of the best light bulb moments I've had in the classroom have involved not reading or talking directly about an idea, but instead engaging it by using Bitcoin. So I have mempool.spaces up on the screen behind me, and I have students running full nodes. And I have students sending each other sats and being frustrated with channel management on Lightning and wondering about this liquid thing and what are the risks and what is an L2 versus an L1.5. And you start asking questions that are practical about how to use this software, but they often lead you right back to more general principles and questions with which we began. And now you have a new insight into them and you see why they matter and how they actually affect the real world. So for me as a teacher, it's the engaged stuff that's often the most fun and the most exciting. So I teach a class, it's Tuesday, Friday, for example, right now, a Bitcoin philosophy and economics class. Tuesdays, we read. Friday, we engage. And that's where we have a lot of fun, and that's where we actually do a lot of the learning.
I've talked to a lot of students about Bitcoin, and I used to explain to them things like the supply cap, and they just don't understand the monetary or financial world well enough at age 18 or 19. If you're 18 or 19 out there and you're here, you're ahead of the game. They just don't know how the system works, and so you first have to explain the system, and then it takes too long, and they don't get it. So I explain to them the degradation of privacy in an internet world, and they are absolutely familiar with their data being collected and sold. And I explain that they might someday, if not already, have data that they don't want people to know about. And I think they pretty quickly grasp the privacy and censorship resistance concerns about Bitcoin. And then I hand them the little Bitcoin book, which is my favorite Bitcoin book for explaining Bitcoin. And then I tell them to come back to my office hours and we can talk about it after they've read a little bit.
So every depth has a surface, but not every surface has a depth. And I think for most students that I encounter, they are familiar with the surface of Bitcoin that they see in the headlines, the potential terrorism funding, the potential money laundering, the price increases or the price drops, and especially over the past couple years, things like FTX and Celsius. I think pulling the peel off of Bitcoin from these headlines is eye-opening for many students, and they see that there are many layers of depth beyond. And not just layers of depth, but layers of depth which speak to Bitcoin's benefits for humanity and its potential for human flourishing.
I've got a question that kind of goes in the other direction. So this time more bringing your academic credentials to the Bitcoin space. What, in your experience, and you may have different answers for this as well if you all want to jump in, what is the biggest philosophical misconception or poor use of philosophical concepts that you see prevalent in Bitcoin discourse and that won't turn the crowd against you, that won't get you hounded off the stage?
Sometimes in this world, we talk about things like first principles thinking as if that was meaningful and good. And my view is that it might not be either. Sometimes you start with first principles, but sometimes you actually don't have an axiom to begin with. Sometimes you don't know where to begin. So you begin with something, some observation, and you work your way backwards to principles. But in my view, discovery often doesn't begin with principles. It begins with particularities. And so some of the philosophy in this space does begin with first principles that other people disagree with. And then there's no way forward because you say, this is my axiom that I began with. There's no reasons to offer for it. It's just the beginning. place. I think it's often more productive to begin not at the beginning, but in fact to begin at the end and work your way backwards and argue a lot and exchange lots of reasons along the way. So that's a very abstract characterization of something that annoys me about Bitcoin and philosophy, and I hope some of you hate what you heard and then come fight me about it later. I mean, have a gentle, reasoned discussion about second and first principles.
The most frustrating thing for me is when people say Bitcoin is, and then they insert something that they are.
Venice.
And so you might not. So I think the one that frustrates me the least is that Bitcoin is Venice. The one that frustrates me the most probably is Bitcoin is libertarian, as though you need to be a libertarian to understand and know and appreciate Bitcoin. And I'm not a libertarian, and I understand, well, I mean, nobody understands Bitcoin as we'll learn, but I understand it pretty well, and I appreciate it anyways. So when people try to bring their own views to Bitcoin and say that Bitcoin is an expression of those views, I would just say Bitcoin is an expression of lots of different views, and there's no one thing that Bitcoin is. I thought I was going to get booze, so thank you.
Alan's question backfired. For me, it's not so much what's commonly spoken or said or written, even on Twitter. What bothers me from time to time is sometimes just a lack of humility. And I think that the world is really complicated. Money is very complex. At least speaking for myself, I don't have a ton of cognitive horsepower up here, and so I'm not going to figure everything out. And I think that the reason I think this frustrates me is that there are people who would be more amenable to receive the very real truths about Bitcoin if, in fact, we were more humble in how we communicated about it.
So you're saying we should stay humble and... Oh, but you can't say stack sats. Just stay humble. Yeah. Stay humble and see what happens.
Stack knowledge.
Ah, that's good. Yeah. All right, we've only got a few minutes left. So what I want to do now, I was looking forward to this the whole time. I want to do kind of a quick fire round. Don't think about the answers to this too much. Just say whatever feels right. But the point of this is to try to, obviously nobody's read the book isn't out yet, but give the audience a bit of a flavor of what I genuinely thought was really insightful, really interesting argumentation in the book. So you'll recognize where this comes from. You might laugh when I ask some of these questions. So, is money a social kind or a natural kind? Go.
Social kind.
Why?
Because we made it. It didn't exist before us, and it won't exist after us. And it has to be us. You can't make money all on your own. So it's not just a human kind, but a social kind.
Does Bitcoin exist in physical or mathematical space?
Mathematical space.
Why?
Well, just someone pull out a $20 bill. If you have the bill, you don't have 20 of something. You have the one thing. And if you look at it, you'll see the 20. What's that 20 representing? 20 units of money, $20. Where does that exist? Well, it's not the bill, so it has to be something abstract. And a Bitcoin UTXO represents a certain quantity of Satoshis in the very same way. And where are those Satoshis? Well, in the same place as the dollars are, even if you have a physical dollar bill to represent them.
Why is money like the word for mother in lots of different languages?
Sure. So, suppose we set out to create an artificial language. We make up words for certain objects in the world. We might even have a really great grammar, which is much more intuitive even than English. But in constructing such an artificial language, you might lose some of the lessons that have been hard-won just through the evolution of not only us as language speakers, but as the languages themselves. And this is actually what we find in the case of Esperanto. Esperanto has a word for mother that is, let's say, not a natural word for infants infants to say. But you know what is very natural for infants to say? And it's basically what infants say worldwide when they speak their first words, mama, okay? And so there's a kind of lesson here from the evolutionary language that language is not just something that we make up, but it's also something that evolves with us. And there are certain features of money, likewise, that make for good features of money. And this speaks to, I think, in part, the miracle of Bitcoin, that even though it's artificial, it has the kinds of good qualities that you would want money to have.
All right, last one, and then we're going to get kicked off stage. Human teeth make surprisingly good money, albeit not perfect. Discuss.
Yeah.
Correct. They're very scarce.
Human teeth are small and portable and scarce and distinguishable from each other, kind of mostly fungible. They come in different denominations and stuff, so they would work great as money. We distinguish questions of good money, apt money, and resistance money. And something can be an apt money. It could function well as a money without being it morally good for that thing to be money. I think we could all agree it would be very bad for human teeth to be money. And so thank goodness we have Bitcoin.
Excellent final statement. If you guys want to follow on, I mean, we are out of time, but any parting, buy the book, obviously. Only buy Bitcoin if you want to. They're not telling you to do that, but they are telling you to buy the book. Is there any parting message beyond that you would like to give? Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.